Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Thank you for joining us today for our program, The Sordid Truth About Sex Trafficking. Please note that due to the subject matter of today's program, some of the discussion topics and images shown will include content of a mature nature. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email address are on the screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts, sign-in sheets, and evaluations are all available online. You'll need to register for this program in order to access these materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses, social workers, and EMS staff for today's program. In order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, CE credit will only be awarded for 1 year for nurses and EMS expiring on December 31st, 2019, and 2 years for social workers expiring December 31st, 2020. Hi, I'm Bill Kennedy, the State Social Work Director here at the Alabama Department of Public Health, and I'd like to welcome our presenters today who are both from Camille Place. Adam Morgan is the Executive Director, and Renee Carpenter is the Social Service Director, and a familiar face to us here at ADPH. Welcome back.
Thank you, Bill. We really appreciate the opportunity and the invite back by the Alabama Public Health to do this, to shed a little light on sex trafficking today. If you missed it, we were here 2 weeks ago discussing human trafficking, the nightmare next door. You can find that training on their website in the archives. Be glad for you to watch it. That's part one of this. But today we're going to go more in depth on sex trafficking. This is probably a topic you're a little more familiar hearing. Something that's talked a little bit more about in the news. A lot of TV shows, crime shows are picking this up because it is such a reality that's being brought to light in the United States. Before we get started, I want to, if you have a pen and a paper, I'd love for you to jot down this number, 43,200. That's just a number I want you to stick with. Just think about that and as we go through the slides, and I'll bring it back up later on. So first, let's talk a little bit about the statistics of sex trafficking. One of the things we talked about last training was the Polaris Project. This is a non-governmental, non-profit agency based out of Washington, D.C., actually founded by 2 college students. They were seniors at Brown University, found out about the reality of sex trafficking from a story that broke out of New Hampshire of 6 Korean women who were being forced to work in a brothel. So at 22 years old, they decided they want to find a way and find an organization to stop human trafficking. So they formed the Polaris Project, the name based off the star that led the slaves to freedom. In 2007, they started the National Human Trafficking Hotline, operated by them, and it was also co-founded by another agency out of California. And since 2007, they have received reports of over 3,400 sex trafficking cases. Now, just in 2018 alone, and we still have a few weeks left in 2018, there's been over 3,700 cases of sex trafficking reported. So you see the number is staying steady, and it's continuing to grow a little bit, especially here in the United States, as kind of a trafficking hub for the world. In 2017, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimated that 1 in 7 endangered runaways reported to them were likely sex trafficking victims. And we're going to talk a little bit more throughout the program about runaways and how that's such a contributing factor and starting point for these sex trafficking victims. Globally, the International Labor Organization estimates that there are 4.8 million people trapped in forced sexual exploitation globally. I stated the phrase last time, there are more slaves now than ever before in history. That's a phrase that actually brought me into this fight as a college student. That's a reality check for me to realize just how big of a business this is. According to the National Runaway Hotline, 1 in 3 runaways will be lured into sex trafficking within 48 hours of leaving home. Now, 48 hours is one of those numbers that stick with us. You have the show 48 hours, and it said statistically, if a child is not found within the first 48 hours, they're likely to never be found again. So that 48 hours is such a key sticking point with these sex trafficking victims. And according to the Department of Justice, 70% of traffickers, also known as pimps, are male, and each pimp can make upwards of $200,000 per victim annually. So this is what they consider a hot commodity. This is something that can be sold numerous times. Unlike a drug that's sold once and it's done, they've realized how much money they can make off of a human being. They can sell this person upwards of 30 times a day. And you'll actually see later on in the slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Youth, pimps manage around 4 to 6 victims. Now, a lot of times they try to keep this number. So you'll have some that they'll sell off. It happens more in the Middle East and Europe. They'll sell a child permanently. So they're always keeping that number of 4 to 6. They're going to pick somebody up after that. They want to make sure they're keeping their profit margin high for them. According to the International Labor Organization, the amount of money generated from sex trafficking alone is $99 billion. Shared Hope International, another organization we discussed last time, states that the quotas are often set between $300 and $2,000 per day, which means that each victim is sold upwards of 10 to 30 times a day. Now that is, we say 30 times, I want you to realize this is not just a time. This is 10 to 30 men that they're being sold to, or women. 10 to 30 times that they're being raped in one day. So you start adding those numbers up, and it continues to grow. We go back to that number I gave you in the beginning, 43,200. Last year, CNN did a story on a girl, Carla Jacinto, out of Mexico. She was lured away at the age of 12 to a man who promised her the world. She was abused as a child, so she wanted to get out of that way. So she found this guy who has promised her the cars, the nice house, became her boyfriend, and after about 3 months, she realized what reality was about to become. She averaged 30 guys a day that she was sold, and it was estimated over 43,200 times was she raped in the 4 years that she was exploited. And thankfully, she was rescued at the age of 16. She even had an opportunity, she thought, around the age of 14. They were in a hotel, and the hotel shut down, police raided, and she just thought that she was finally about to be free. But we see in this story what is so true in many other countries where the police and the government are part of it. Those police weren't raiding to rescue her, but they were raiding to be able to rape the girls themselves. They started off taking videos of the girls and using it as leverage against them, and continued to rape them throughout the night. So this is a reality. 10 to 30 times a day means 10 to 30 men. 10 to 30 times that they lose hope. So remember that number, 43,200. In just a little under 4 years, how many times she estimated she was raped. Thankfully, she has gone on and telling her story and bringing light to the reality, the situation that's going on in Mexico and her hometown and across the world. The Child Rescue Network states that the average age of entry into the life of sex trafficking for girls is 13 years old, and for boys is 12 years old. Now we see this number a little bit earlier in boys. Preferably, they're usually prepubescent, and the girls, they usually try to find a time before they're sexually active. They start their profit off a lot higher with a girl that's not sexually active in the beginning, and of course, as that goes on, they decide we're going to lower the price and sooner or later throw the girl away. So that's why you're seeing these age groups here. The boys, they don't want them to be able to fight back and things like that.
And also, Adam, jump in for just
please.
a minute, but it's also commonplace for a pimp to actually auction off a girl's virginity. And so she can make a lot more money for him if he can sell her as a virgin. Right. Sad but true.
Yeah. And that's kind of the situation which it wasn't. So she talks about auctioning off, and a lot of what was brought to light with trafficking is the movie Taken, and people use that as what they believe is what happens. And there are situations that has happened like that, but you do see in that movie the auction process, and that is reality. That does happen in these big countries with the drug lords and different dignitaries come in who have a lot of money, and they auction these girls off that are virgins that they believe are at prime age for them to sell. So that's a major thing. Next, major sporting events is a huge area that we're going to see in the U.S. as a big center point. Tourist attractions, conventions, anything like that, anything from the Super Bowl to NASCAR races, concert venues, anywhere where there are a good amount of men that come to these events. And a lot of these events, the men are coming without their families, without their wives, especially the Super Bowl. Most of the time you're not going to see, they want to take the son with them or something like that. It's a bunch of guys that come together, and statistically they feel like they're going to be able to find a buyer. So you're seeing this in the Super Bowl. I know here in Alabama, Talladega and other events are major hubs for this. They post ads online. They set up in the hotels near that they know the men are going to be staying at, and they feel it's a supply and demand situation. And that's a huge opportunity for them to gain a lot of revenue in just a few days. So what exactly is sex trafficking? The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 gave the legal definition as a commercial sex act was induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So we go back to the average age of 12 and 13 years old. I want you to remember that's an average age. So we see a lot of situations of younger children, even younger than that, that are being trafficked, being sold by families, which we'll talk a little bit more later on. Different types of sex trafficking include prostitution, pornography, stripping, live sex shows, mail order brides, military prostitution, and sex tourism. Now, a lot of those seem a little foreign to us in the United States. We feel that, if it's happening here, yeah, maybe prostitution, maybe some pornography and strip clubs, but these others do happen here in the U.S. Mail order brides are a real thing that happen in the U.S. It's not just around the world. Military prostitution, not so much here. And sex tourism is a lot of what we talked about with the major sporting events. They use these tourists to come in and give them what they feel that they're desiring to look for while they're free from family or from wives or loved ones. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to really go more in depth on these types of sex trafficking. I'm going to turn it over to Renee.
Okay. Well, if you were with us last time, then you remember we talked about the different types of human trafficking, and sex trafficking is one of those types. Well, what you may not realize is there's also different types of sex trafficking. The Polaris Project that Adam mentioned looked at 32,000 cases from their database that was collected from December of 2007 through December of 2016. And they were able to break down just the sex trafficking into, I think it's about 8 different types of sex trafficking. So it's remote interactive sexual acts, that would be like your webcams. Personal sexual servitude, that's one of those things that a lot of people just cringe when we all should cringe when we hear it, but we don't realize that it's actually going on. But that's personal sex slaves. Of course, pornography is another type of sex trafficking. Strip clubs, then there's residential brothels. Outdoor solicitation, which is probably what most of us think about when you hear the word prostitute or prostitution, is someone who's standing on a street corner, and that's what that is. There's also illicit massage, health, and beauty parlors that are just fronts for brothels, and then also escort services. So let's go into a little more detail about each one of these so that you'll have some idea about how they differ from each other. So remote interactive sex acts, this really came into prominence with the invention of the Internet. Of course, sex trafficking took off with the invention of the Internet. But that is a commercial sex act that is live, but it's simulated through remote contact, and that's between a buyer and a victim. So that would include webcams. It also includes phone sex lines and text-based chat rooms or just chat rooms through the Internet. Now, phone sex lines, of course, have been around probably as long as the telephone has, but the webcams and chat rooms are really a little bit newer on the scene.
So I'm going to break in there to really, I want you to fully grasp what she's talking about with interactive. So these buyers buy into this situation, and they're able to tell the person on the other end exactly what to do to the victim. So you may have one guy in the room, and you may have multiple, and these buyers are going into these chat rooms while they're watching it live, and they're able to buy different sex acts to watch. It may be just one guy raping, or they may be buying in to watch 4 or 5 guys raping the same girl. So this is a truly interactive process that they're allowed to not really get their hands dirty and maybe even make them feel a little better about it, because it's not something that's as tangible to them, so that they don't feel as guilty usually. I know that's a sad thing to say, but it's kind of the reality. They feel like if they're not there doing it, then it's not their problem. All they're doing is paying money. So that's what they're able to do in those interactive webcam shows and chat rooms.
And a lot of them also may feel like this is actors that are portraying this, and they may not realize that it is an actual rape that's occurring. Okay, personal sexual servitude. This occurs when a woman or girl is sold, and a lot of times they're sold by family, to an individual buyer for the explicit purpose of engaging in sex acts over a long period of time. So this is considered a permanent arrangement. Our runaway and homeless youth and LGBTQ minors are especially vulnerable to this, and it also occurs in forced marriage situations. Now, it also occurs with kidnapping. Probably, when I say personal sexual servitude and we talk about kidnapping, you probably can remember J.C. Lee Dugard. That would be probably the most famous, I guess you would call it, situation. But she was held captive for 18 years and was a sex slave. So it's something that is truly a nightmare. And again, if these children, if they're not found quickly, many times they're never found, or it's many, many years later. Pornography. This is not just videos that someone purchases over the Internet. This is, oftentimes it's family members or an intimate partner or a sex trafficker that videotapes the victim, and then they earn a profit by distributing the victim's non-consenting appearance in pornographic materials. Child pornography, the ages go way down to very young children, even babies are involved in this. This is also where the term revenge porn, I'm sure you're familiar with that, where a perpetrator will videotape the victim in what is considered to be a loving situation, but then later on they'll post it on the Internet as a way to get back at that person or a way to extort.
I'm going to just step in here, kind of give a kudos, just talking about this area of sex trafficking. It was just this past month that Congress, without any dissenting votes, passed the Hatch Child Pornography Victims Assistance Act. This is really putting to a front exactly that the victims in this are exactly that, victims. So they're allowing restitution to these victims. They're actually allowing them to use the material of the pornography in court cases to further criminalize the perpetrator on this and to give longer sentences to them. So I want to give kudos to bipartisanship for once to give us a starting point on this part of sex trafficking. Is a lot of things coming out in the past few years where legislatures are really working hard on this. So I'm thankful that they're continuing to try to keep up with the times and give victims exactly what they need.
Good deal. You also may think of pornography as, and you've probably heard this, that it's a victimless crime, that the actors involved are being paid for what they do, and so they're not being forced into it. That's simply not true in most cases. In some cases it is. But when you're looking at a video, you don't know what's going on behind the camera. You only see what's happening in front of the camera. So you don't know the situation about what, it could be somebody holding a gun on the actors. And so they're being forced into this. So just remember, it is not a victimless crime at all.
So the demand is what makes it happen. So people continuously want to watch it and want to pay for it. It's going to continue to happen. So like she said, it's not victimless. Even just a one-time thing, you're part of that sex trafficking act. You're part of taking away hope from the person that's in that video. Like she said, yes, sometimes it is they want to be there, but in a lot of cases is girls that have been dehumanized and decided this is the only way that their worth is to be here and to be in that moment of selling their bodies for pornography.
Most of the victims are female, but male victimization in pornography is 4 times the rate than in any other type of sex trafficking. So males are truly victimized in this. Another type is strip clubs. Now, these tend to be places where traffickers exploit for both labor and sex trafficking. So here, if you've ever looked at statistics for human trafficking, you'll see it broken down into labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and then there's a smaller number that's labor and sex trafficking. And that's, this is one type where it fits both labor and sex trafficking. The victims are used to provide either flirtatious companionship or any kind of lap dance, anything like that. And it's to try to get the men that are there, and typically it is men, to buy more drinks, spend more money. And oftentimes there is an implied agreement that sex will be a part of that. Now, some of the bars are run entirely by organized trafficking networks. These are very well organized. They're huge. Other times it may be just a lone individual who runs the bar. The victims tend to be females between ages 14 and 29. So think about that. You've got a strip club where you have to be of age, a legal adult, to get in, and yet the ones who are stripping, some of them are as young as 14 years old. Residential, this can occur within, this is of course brothels, that's run by coordinated networks of traffickers. It may be a private household. It could be parents selling their children, as horrible as that is. Advertising is through word of mouth most often. There are online ads, and previously on Backpage.com, and I've got to discuss Backpage for a minute. Backpage was actually sued by several individuals who were victimized. One of those individuals was from Dothan, Alabama. And this was a situation where, as a minor, the child was being sold at a Choice Hotels, Quality Inn in Dothan, and was being sold repeatedly during the weekdays. The trafficker actually gained diamond status as a frequent flyer to Quality Inn, and he would rent several rooms. He had girls in each room, and he always asked for extra towels, always paid cash. So this should have been a red flag to somebody that something nefarious was definitely going on there. So this child has now sued Backpage.com because that's where she was advertised. She's also sued Choice Hotels, and she sued her trafficker. I'm not sure about the status of the suit at this point, but in April of this year, Backpage was shut down by coordinated effort by the FBI and several other federal agencies for promoting prostitution. And part of that came about by this lawsuit. So that is happening in Alabama. It's in Dothan. So if you think it's not happening here, it definitely is happening here. Now, residential brothels will also use business cards. Of course, it doesn't say that you're buying sex or that this is a brothel. That's illegal. So they're very covert. And again, in private households, the victims tend to be younger than, and the victims are also both boys and girls. And again, most of the time, this is families selling children. Outdoor solicitation. This is what you normally think about when you hear the word prostitution. This is what we see on TV shows and in the movies, is scantily clad women who are walking up and down a strip of sidewalk, or they're standing on a street corner. This is very common at truck stops. It's common at rest stops and again on street corners. The victims tend to have a history of trauma and abuse. Oftentimes they have addiction issues. Think about being sold 10 to 30 times a day for sex. The only way to get through it is with some type of coping mechanism, and many of them will choose drugs as a coping mechanism, but also their traffickers will use drugs to keep them in the business, to keep them from leaving the trafficker, because he supplies them with their drugs. They also tend to have chronic mental health issues, and homelessness is a huge factor. So runaway youth are especially vulnerable. They have no job skills. They have no other means of supporting themselves other than to sell their bodies. And as we've heard, within 48 hours of running away, they're typically approached by someone who is offering to take care of them. Many times there's no strings attached initially, but that's part of the grooming process. And then later on, it's obvious that that's what the trafficker is doing, is selling the child, usually, in order for that child to pay for his or her room and board. Now, illicit massage parlors and health and beauty businesses, this is the other time where we will see labor and sex trafficking happening at the same place. These tend to be businesses that are just a facade. They pretend to offer massage services or maybe waxing services, anything like that. But it's actually just a front for the primary business, which is selling sex. We know that there are at least 7,000 of these storefront facilities in the United States, but there's probably far more than that. It would be very much underreported. Now, the victims in the massage industry tend to be a little older. You know, we talked about the strip clubs where the young women are between 14 and 29. The massage parlors, the victims tend to be a little older, mid-30s to late 50s. Now, in the beauty side of it, they tend to be younger, mid-20s and older.
Now, one thing, Renee, you see with this is these women that get started here and stay for years, 20, 30 years even, they are taken from the sex trafficking side of this business as groomers for these younger girls that come in to start off with. So one of their jobs becomes keeping them calm during the situation so that they don't really make a stink to the traffickers, and showing them the ropes, per se, to really what to do not to get in trouble, what to do to not get beat by the trafficker. So they take on both sides of the same coin throughout their time there.
And a lot of times the victims are from Southeast Asia. Then escort services. This is what we are referring to a commercial sex act that primarily occurs in a temporary indoor location. So that makes it different from what we see on the street. This is usually when we have girls and young women who are in hotel rooms. If it's called an out call, that's when the trafficker will deliver the victim to a private location. It could be a residence. It could be a party. Bachelor parties are notorious for that. And then in calls would be when the buyer actually comes to the place where the victim is housed. Most of the time that's in a hotel room. The buyers are cycled through, and most of the time end calls are occurring in a location where the victim is only there for a few hours. You may wonder, why doesn't law enforcement come in and raid the place, and oftentimes they do. But the trafficker is always working 2 or 3 stops ahead, arranging times and appointments with buyers. And so the girl may be in one place for 3 hours, then she may be moved an hour down the highway to another hotel, and she'll be there for a couple of hours, and then move on again. So they usually work on what's called a circuit. It could be that they start out in Atlanta, they come down through Auburn, Opelika, they'll be there for a little while, they'll come on into Montgomery, be here for a little while, maybe go back up to Birmingham, and then end up back in Atlanta within a 24 to 36 hour time frame. So they stay on the move, and again, that's to stay one step ahead of law enforcement, and also to try to arrange as many buyers as possible during that time. So I'm going to pass it back to Adam for this.
The picture you see on the screen was taken from Polaris Project. This is talking about where is sex trafficking happening. So these are the hot spots that have been, through reporting and through cases that have come down the pipeline, of actual sex trafficking. So you see a lot of it on the coastal areas, a lot in the southeast and northeast. But now remember, just because there's a hot spot there or there's not a hot spot there doesn't mean that that's not happening. These are just your major crime locations for this. The next slide is actually a zoomed in picture of the southeast, and we've marked the different cities. You see how it's the major metropolis areas are your hot spots, obviously. New Orleans and Mobile being your port cities, where a lot are actually coming in or they are sitting there waiting on different entities coming into the ports. That's a big selling point right there. And then Atlanta being one of your major hotspots and actually one of your biggest hubs for North and South America. The international airport there is a major place for them to a starting point to get them to other countries. In cities, it's Nashville and Birmingham, as she stated. These are all major hotspot areas. They're where the big money is. A lot of men, and a lot of a supply and demand situation, especially in all these areas.
Atlanta is also a place where there are a lot of conventions. There's a lot of professional sporting events that occur there. So that's another reason why it's such a hot spot.
Yeah. And same with like New Orleans, and like both of those places are home to NFL teams. And then, like I said, NFL gaming events are big spots for these traffickers. And then, just going back a little bit, so they're traveling these hot spots. They're traveling in between these different hot spots. Another thing this does is kind of wears the victim out and keeps them from fighting, and it actually puts them on a more dependent nature for these sex traffickers to really control them. So moving into the minor domestic sex trafficking, we've talked a little bit about the average age, but the average age into prostitution for teenage girls is actually 12 to 14 years old. Again, this is kind of what the traffickers consider a prime age for starting point. The average age of entry into prostitution for boys is 11 to 13 years old, those prepubescent years. And going with this is we talk about the Safe Harbor Act of 2016. This is something we did discuss a little bit in the last training. So this act was brought about because a lot of times when a minor would be picked up for prostitution or for selling drugs, what would happen is they would be treated as criminals instead of victims. Even though they're not of age to even make those decisions of sex, they consider them of age really to be treated as criminals. Not only does this further traumatize the victim, it breeds a distrust of law enforcement and continues to keep them away from the services they need to become better off mentally. So what happened is they created this law, even though federally and in most states they were known as victims, they were treated as criminals. So they brought this on as a way for legal protection and for services to be provided to the youth that were found as prostitutes or as people selling drugs on the streets. So this is allowing them, a lot of states are allowing immunity of those crimes, and then they provide them the services, anywhere from mental health services to even to job training. They're trying to find ways to not further traumatize the victim, bring them a little sense of hope and betterment of their life, and realize that life is not all about what they've been experiencing. So I think the last count was about 38 states have passed the Safe Harbor Act, Alabama being one of those states. So we're really thankful that you're starting to see government agencies and these big organizations realize what has been happening is we've created a cycle of distrust and losing hope and further traumatizing these victims, and we're starting to finally find a way to bring them out of that cycle.
And in defense of law enforcement, they really had no other means of getting these kids off the street than to arrest them for prostitution. It was a way to separate them from their trafficker. Unfortunately, it routed them into the juvenile justice system rather than into a victim treatment system. But it was a way for them to be separated from their trafficker. So I'm glad that this passed. It's definitely needed. It's a much better way to treat them. But I don't want it to sound like law enforcement was just out doing whatever they could to try to penalize these kids. They really had no other options. And
at the times, the law enforcement agencies weren't really trained in the mental health side of things. So I'm not saying they didn't understand, but there wasn't a sense of urgency of helping that side of the victim. I don't know if they really realized the traumatization they were putting. And so when you breed that distrust, also you're keeping other victims or that victim later on from wanting to report their abuse, because they feel like if they go to law enforcement, that's what's going to happen to them. So we're really growing in that area, and very thankful for that. One of the high-risk activities associated with prostitution is running away. So we've talked about running away a bunch in this program. One of the ones, the story that I told you, was a runaway situation. These are kids that are coming out of, a lot of times coming out of abused homes, and they may run away just to get away, or they may have found somebody online, maybe a young girl who is being abused at home, meets what they believe to be a young guy online who's promising them the world, and they feel like that's their best option. So they run away, and they realize mighty quickly that it's not exactly what they thought. But at that point, there's a shame in turning back a lot of times and admitting that you were wrong, or even there's just no way of getting out of that situation. So we see prostitution become the life that they gain from running away. Experts report that an adolescent who runs away is likely to be approached by a trafficker or pimp within 48 hours. These pimps, we kind of see them on TV as the lowly guys who are dirty and cringy. A lot of these are professionals. These people know they're attracted to vulnerability, and they understand how to manipulate the situation to get what they want. These are actually usually very smart individuals. So if they weren't already in contact with the runaway prior to, they can spot them just as good as anything and say, this is somebody I can manipulate. You see a young girl that's on her own at 14 years old, is probably a pretty good opportunity for them to go in. And actually, the story I told you earlier, what he did was use so they didn't actually meet prior to the runaway for Carla, but they met on the street. He saw her at a bus stop by herself, so he approached her and started talking about how he was abused as a young child, never knowing her story. But statistically, it's likely that a girl that age who has run away, he feels like she's come from an abusive home. So he's gaining her trust in that situation, and then he starts promising her all these different things. And that's where like I said, those traffickers, they spot them out quickly, that vulnerability, and they know how to manipulate the situation.
And a child on the streets has no way of buying food. So one of the things that a trafficker will do is buy their lunch. and while they're sitting there eating, they'll talk to them, and very quickly they are able to figure out what the currency is for this child. They figure out what is it that he or she is looking for, what are they missing in their life, and then he can very quickly manipulate the situation so that he makes them feel like he's going to meet that need, whatever it may be. And that's how they'll start to manipulate the child.
Right. So 40% to 50% of boys who end up in prostitution ran away or were thrown out of their homes due to sexual identity issues. And that's something that Renee actually brought up earlier. This is very common in the LGBTQ community. They're thrown out of their homes because a parent just can't handle the situation at that point. They disown them. They may abuse them first and send them away. So these boys are going out into a world that they feel like they're never going to get the acceptance at home. So let me find a way to get acceptance in the world. So you see this a lot in that community. So we have some different signs of minor domestic sex trafficking. This is not only for you to be on the watch, but this is also some stuff that even as parents, you can kind of keep in your mind in this situation, because this does happen. It can happen to anybody. So unexplained school absences, an abrupt change in attire, behavior, or the relationships, the presence of an older boyfriend or even an older girlfriend. So you have a child who's coming home with a 14-year-old girl who's coming home with new jewelry that you didn't buy, expensive jewelry, expensive purses, shoes, or a boy who's coming home with iPads or something like that, and that you know that you had no say in. It's probably a pretty good sign that there's another entity out there that's trying to spoil this individual, to really gain their trust and to gain their love. A child is traveling with an older male who is not a guardian. Now, obviously, you're not going to know a lot of times in passing if that's their father or something like that, but you're a lot of times going to see the distrust in the situation, the face of the child, and seeing how they interact. So it's all about watching for those small micro cues and how the interaction is with the two. The sudden presence of expensive material, like I said, chronic running away. If they're continually running away, say it's from a good home, it's possible that they're running to someone else. And a lot of times, yeah, it's possible that it's maybe another person their age and it's just a little rebellion. But a lot of times it's the trafficker is calling them or texting them saying, hey, I need you here. And what's happening is they're taking them away for a few days, they're selling them, and they're putting them back in the situation. And what's happened is the trafficker has gained the trust of the child, and the child's not going to actually report that to the parents. It's just a situation the parents are glad to have the child back home. They may ask a few questions, and they may just let it go, just thankful that they're home. And then homelessness is another major sign of minor domestic sex trafficking. When you have a child at 12 or 13 that's homeless, that's a huge red flag right there. And that's exactly what the pimps are looking for, is somebody that they can go to see. They see they have nothing. Let me give them a little something and take them away from this so that I can control them. Signs of psychological coercion, such as depression, anxiety, over-submissive attitude. Again, these are not it's not always going to be the case of sex trafficking, but it is something that has to be remembered in the back of your mind in these situations when you have a young child. And it's especially so such a major thing with depression, anxiety right now with these young children who are constantly on tablets and phones and talking to other individuals, and bullying becomes a lot of it. So they become in this situation of depression. They may not can feel they can talk to their parents. So a lot of times they find somebody else that they can turn to, somebody they may not know. And again, the trafficker gaining their trust as some hope they feel that can be brought to them. The youth's lack of control over his or her schedule, money, proof of identification. A lot of times you're going to see this in airports and hotels, even such like movie theaters. You can spot this kind of stuff and see that you have somebody standing over them controlling exactly what they do. And again, Not always sex trafficking, but it is a sign to watch for. And then, of course, signs of physical trauma, bruises, cuts. So if you're working in a nursing situation and you're seeing this child of trauma, obviously it's your job to report it. But a lot of times it's not just abuse from home. The person that's there with them may actually be their trafficker. It may just be brought into a situation where the child is brought in and the trafficker comes in after being called, and the child may have given that number as the guardian. The trafficker comes in, and that's how they handle the situation. So who exactly are the victims? Anybody under age of 18 induced in the commercial sex trade is a victim of sex trafficking. There are no ands, ifs, buts about it. They are a minor. They cannot make that decision for themselves, and they are being forced and coerced into this sex trafficking situation. And then adults 18 and over who induced in the commercial sex trade through force, fraud, or coercion. And a lot of times this is going to be what we were talking about with the people who are working in strip clubs, in brothels, 18 or older in pornography. A lot of times they are being coerced or forced to do this. And again, those are the victims of sex trafficking.
And commercial doesn't just mean that it's in exchange for money. It could also be in exchange for drugs or anything of value. So when you see commercial, don't think that it's strictly that money has to change hands. It could be in exchange for anything of value.
Paying off a debt even, so like she said, anything to get something from the other end. It may not be money, but it could be something, anything of value. Victims, they span all socioeconomic backgrounds, all races, ethnicities. They have varying education levels. Both can be citizens and foreign nationals, and may be documented or undocumented. So one of the things you hear a lot, I know nurses hear it a lot, is the phrase about cancer is cancer does not discriminate. Sex trafficking doesn't either. It's anybody that they feel that is vulnerable, that they can take control of mentally and physically and use them to make a profit. So what exactly makes a person vulnerable? Being a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, being abused in the home, growing up by a parent, uncle, an aunt, something like that, who that situation has put them into what they believe is what their worth is, nothing more than to be abused. So they become that vulnerable person who's easy to manipulate from the beginning. From a war-torn area, so a lot in the Middle East, you see this situation. They're constantly used to just a bad situation. They don't really understand there's a better life out there. So you grow up in a home that has nothing, in poverty, and the home has been destroyed by war. You have maybe parents who have been killed in war, and they have nothing else. So they're especially vulnerable to that situation. Being a foreign national who has become indebted to their intermediaries, often a sum that they can never repay. So maybe somebody that's promised them to get them to America. You see a lot of this coming through. You'll have caravans or something like that, or maybe even on ships, you'll have a group of people who are being smuggled in. So what started as smuggling becomes trafficking at that point to pay off a debt to get them across. Having been smuggled into the U.S., they're owing those debts.
This is especially true with unaccompanied minors that may be coming across the borders illegally, of course, whether they're being smuggled or they're sneaking across themselves, but they are at very high risk for being lured into a trafficking situation.
Because they're being used from the beginning a lot of times. A lot of times these smugglers, they don't realize they're not only charging a fee from them, but they may already have sold them across the way and nobody realizes it. So they're actually going into this sex trafficking situation thinking they're going in to get a better life or a better job, but they're actually being used for profit in the end. So who exactly are the traffickers? You know who the victims are. So traffickers, the terminology we use is pimps. Most are men who lure and ensnare their victims with promises of high-paying careers. A loving relationship is a huge thing to these vulnerable people who have come out of a home who they don't feel have ever been loved. So they find these people who are giving them the love that they've always craved. I think everybody, we're made to crave love, and that's what these traffickers are giving them. And then you do have the situations of kidnapping and physical violence. Not as common a lot of times. It's actually a little more rare sometimes that you're going to see that, because that is such a high risk to the traffickers. So they're going to try to go a little more under the radar. So you're not going to see that as much. Yes, kidnapping happens a good bit, but a lot of times that's more of a domestic situation.
We see it a lot. We talk about number one there, the high-paying, lucrative career. A lot of times with modeling jobs, they'll want to take the person to a location for a photo shoot, for example. While they're there, they may say, oh, well, I need a copy of your driver's license and your Social Security card because you're going to make all this money and we're going to have to withhold taxes, yada, yada. And they never give those back. And so that's, now the person may be 3-4 hours away from home. They have no way to get back. They have no identification with them. And suddenly they're trapped. So traffickers are truly snakes in the grass. They are very manipulative, and they know what they're doing.
And they use those sites like Backpage that we talked about earlier, thankfully that's not in operation anymore, to put out these ads for a model. And these young girls who maybe they just want some money for college, or maybe they want to be famous one day. They take that opportunity and they end up in that situation. And it may start off as them just trying to flirt their way into with the victim, but it becomes that situation. And talking about the controlling of their identification, that's a lot of what's happening with the smuggling victims, is for them to get them over the border or into another country, I have to hold on to all this so I can check you in or do all this other stuff. When they get across the border, they have control of them at that point. So they use any means to control the situation. They frequently use substance abuse along with threats of violence and torture against the victim or even their family as means of control. So a lot of times, if it's a good situation at home and they've captured this victim, they may threaten to hurt the parents that they love or hurt their sibling, or even use that saying, well, you know, maybe they're picking them up from a bus stop or something and pretending that something has happened to the family, or the family is wanting them to come take them and get them to the hospital for a situation. Any kind of manipulation trick they can use. And a lot of times it's never going to be a situation where they touch the family, but the victim truly believes that at that point. Some traffickers are lone individuals, but you do have some that are in these extensive criminal networks. So we talked a little bit last time about how drug trafficking was being kind of skirted away due to different laws and stuff like that. So these drug lords and big organizations started going into the sex trafficking business, and this is where you see these major criminal networks being part of the trafficking rings. They share a common thread. Anybody that's willing to exploit others to make a profit. They don't see these as people. They see them as commodities they can sell. So they have no mental acuity to realize really what's in front of them and what they're doing. Familial pimping is a really growing problem we're believed to be driven by the opioid crisis. So these families, especially in the impoverished areas, become addicted to opioids such as heroin and stuff like that, and they realize, well, maybe I don't have a way to pay for it again, but I have to have my fix. Well, I have a 2-month-old baby here that I don't really need to take care of anyway, so why don't I sell the child to make a little money just to get my fix for the next time? And I don't think a lot of times they realize the permanency of that situation. So they're using the child to pay that, or they may be paying their drug dealer back. Maybe they're indebted to that person where they're going to use that, the child, or maybe they decide, okay, my child can be used as a means of income numerous times. So that's when you get into the child pornography situations and the residential situations where the children are being sold so that they can pay for their fix. According to Children of the Night, which is an anti-trafficking nonprofit, if a child is 10 years of age or younger and involved in prostitution, the parents are usually involved in the sexual exploitation of the child. This is more common than none, parents being involved in this. It's even more of a sad truth to me that the parent who is given this opportunity to love a child is using them as a means of income. They may set up parties in their neighborhoods. There has been situations in these small suburban areas where the parents are using the child, and they may be that person in the neighborhood. You see that a lot with drug dealers. They pick their regions and they pick their neighborhoods, and that's who I'm going to sell to. It's the same situation with selling children.
And it could be not just the parents. It could be an older sibling. It could be another relative. It could be a grandparent. And that's why we call it familial pimping, because it could be anybody in the family or even a close friend who's like family.
Right. So what are the different steps that traffickers take to gain control of victims? Step one, the main key point here is just dehumanization and really forcing their mind to realize this is what life is and that's okay. It's not okay, but they fit that. Again, that's back to what Renee said earlier, it's the coping mechanism situation. So they'll force them to watch porn. They'll get them ingrained in that lifestyle, realize this is okay. So if you watch enough of it, it's okay for me to even be a part of it. Gang rapes, sexual assaults, they'll give them a new name, identification. So they're taking away their old life and they're making this victim think that this is who owns me at that point. They have given me my name, they own me. And they teach them, they train them how to speak and behave in different situations. Each trafficker kind of has their way of handling the situation with how the victim behaves. And different situations depending on the people who are buying into this situation. So it's different maybe for a dignitary that comes in, different for a businessman, or maybe just a John off the street. They have to teach them how to handle these situations that give them the most profit margin in that. Step two is the betrayal. So the boyfriend becomes the boss. That's the situation I was talking about earlier. They become that loving relationship person, that boyfriend, maybe the girlfriend, and a few months down the road after they've gained the trust, he becomes the boss, becomes the pimp of that child or victim. They introduce him to other women in what they call their stable. So again, kind of with the beauty parlors we were talking about earlier, they have these women who have been there and been a part of it for a while who kind of become almost a mother figure to the victims and help the traffickers. Not always are these women victims themselves. They are actually part of the ring of traffickers. Loving and calm home environment that just all of a sudden becomes violent, and they feel like, well, it's been okay up till now. Maybe this is an isolated situation. We can stick it out. And again, they're continuing to dehumanize and to take away the worth of that child to them. And then they break their promises. But I love my boyfriend, so I'm going to stay here and I'm going to do what he says. I'm going to give him what he wants, and maybe he won't break a promise the next time. It's taking full control of that trust situation. And step three, they take away the power completely. They control the money, control all types of identification. They threaten with violence. Maybe they threaten the parents. They threaten the brother or sister. Tell the person they have no options. They can't go anywhere. Your family doesn't love you anymore. They don't want to take you back. If you leave, you won't have anything. They force the reality on that person that they are totally dependent on the trafficker for everything. So if they believe if they leave, they may be killed. Nobody else is going to love them, so they decide to stay there. And they make the victim feel like she's worthless. She's nothing more than that commodity to sell. She's only worth the $20 she brings in or the $200 she brings in. after each situation.
And he will also make sure that she sees him assault someone else, maybe even murder someone else, so that those threats of violence are more than just threats. I mean, they know that this man can carry out those threats, and so it just instills such fear.
So how do they control their victims? They utilize tactics, like she said, as physical assault and sexual assault, maybe not always on that person. Maybe a victim, so we talked about earlier, they have 4 to 6 women at a time that they're pimping out. Well, they have nothing else to do but become friends with each other a lot of times, so they see them assault maybe their friend who is also a victim. They search for the vulnerabilities of their targets and exploit those. Again, these are professionals, to say the least. They know exactly what the child is feeling a lot of times. They see the vulnerabilities and they see how to manipulate those. Initially, it's seen as a meeting a need, but it quickly becomes their way of fostering that dependence. They have to have the trafficker to live. They have to have the trafficker to be fed, to be clothed, even if they gain a new wardrobe, and it's nothing more than to have a better outfit for the next John that comes along. So I think this is actually a good stopping point for us to take a quick 15-minute break, give you all a little time to think about what we've said, maybe start writing down some questions for us. So we'll take about a 15-minute break here. All right, welcome back. I hope you learned a lot the first hour. I think actually we had a couple of emailed questions, so we're going to start off with those before we get back into the topic.
We do have a couple questions. So the first one, it says, if you're a parent, how do you keep a predator away from your minor child? What if the minor child has already been brainwashed, but the parent is now figuring out the situation and wants to protect that child?
Oh, that's a great question.
Excellent.
The best way to protect the child is to know where they are, what they're doing, and who they're with. And that also includes knowing what social media sites they're on, finding out who are their friends. I don't know what age child we're talking about, but younger children in particular. Now, it's a little harder to keep up with teenagers. We all know that. But we've got to know who they're hanging out with, and especially what's going on their phones. Most every child now has a smartphone. They're able to get, not only to get on any of the chat rooms, but they're able to download pornography. And when they start watching pornography at a young age, it's just like starting to drink alcohol or use drugs at a young age. It damages the brain, and the brain becomes addicted. And so that's where porn addictions can, usually they start at a very young age. So you've got to be able to put some of those parental controls in place to be able to make sure that the child is not able to access some of that stuff. I think it's also great to keep an open line of communication. Maybe go ahead and talk about this kind of thing to a child so that the child knows that he or she can come to you anytime and talk about this.
Yeah, it's a tricky subject, obviously, and it may be a little awkward to talk to a child about that, but it's the communication and loving on that child, making sure they know that what they have at home is what they need. Obviously you don't feel like you want to micromanage your child, but those smartphones, there's so many apps out there to be able to know what's going on with your child, to know where your child is. But going along with the young age with pornography, American Family actually came out last year with a report stating that you need to be talking to your children at age 5 and 6 about pornography. Now, my nephew's 8 years old. At that point, at 7, that was a scary thought to even think about talking to him about pornography. But it's reality. He came home that had a friend telling them what to Google, and it would bring up pornographic sites. And it's at that age that they're so impressionable. So they're starting to watch these things, and they feel like that's the norm, that's okay. So they become vulnerable to these traffickers who come into these situations. So it's you got to start on the front end. Be honest and open with these kids. The media is, TV is, they see it from them, so they need to be knowing it from you, who loves them and who wants the best for them, and to bring in that side of it, to know that you're wanting to make sure they're protected from that situation.
All right. The second question is, you mentioned earlier that the average age is 12 or 13. What's the youngest girl that you've heard of that was victimized?
I've heard of a 6-month-old, and that is just beyond anything I can even wrap my head around. But 6 months is the youngest that I'm aware of. I don't know if you've heard anything any younger.
But I mean, you say victimized, so of course we're thinking more along the line of actual trauma, but a lot of them are sold even younger than that. They're sold from the womb. It may be a trafficking situation where the victim is, the mother is actually a victim already, so the trafficker takes control of the baby immediately after birth. They may not actually traumatize that child at that point, but they're beginning already the grooming process, the loving process. So victimization itself, I would think, could probably start as early as birth, but actual trauma, I know, is the 6-month-old. So there's so much, we don't think about that kind of stuff, and it is a new topic, obviously, that really people haven't considered that young of an age, but that's why it's so important for these services to be brought to light and to really help these victims, because it does start so young.
And you mentioned the trafficker may take possession of the child. One thing that is very common is that when a girl or woman is in a trafficker's stable, we call it, if she has a baby, then he will be listed as the father, although he's not the biological father. That gives him ownership, if you will, of that baby, and gives him another means of controlling her, because he would have as much legal right to that child as she does. So that's just something else to consider. It's just another way that they use to control them.
Okay. One more question here. It's talked about these victims often need, they may have mental health issues, may have medical issues, obviously housing, food, things like that. So once a victim's been identified, what kind of options are available to provide services if they don't have insurance, if they don't have a means to provide services?
Well, unfortunately, not a lot. That's the sad reality, is there's not a lot of services available. I can tell you in Alabama, there are no homes available right now to house victims of trafficking, minors who have been picked up. There are a couple of places for women who have been rescued from trafficking, but not for minors. And so when Camille Place is up and running, we're about to break ground, then we will be the place in Alabama that these minors can go. But that's only girls. As far as I'm aware, there's only one home in the entire United States for male victims who are minors, who have been rescued from trafficking. That's Restore One, I think is the name of it. There are only a few homes. There are no homes in Mississippi for minors. I think there may be one in Louisiana. There's only a few nationwide. And the services, honestly, if they're not paid for by Medicaid, then we've got to locate grants, foundation grants, or federal grants, something to be able to provide these services.
One of the things we talked about earlier, the Safe Harbor Act, and I stated, kind of the two key prongs of that was legal protection and provision of services. So the law is set that it's able to be budgeted for that kind of stuff, but a lot of that hasn't really taken form yet. So it's there to start, but so there's a long way to go on that side. Again, if they don't have that access to Medicaid or something like that, they end up in DHR care, maybe a foster home, and a lot of times that breeds even more of it. So you see more runaways from that situation, continuing the cycle, not hopefully you find a foster home that's loving and is perfect fit, but a lot of times that's not the case. So you see that situation again where they're put back into the cycle, and then services are just not there to bring them out of it.
And it's not the fault of the foster care system, and I don't want anybody thinking that we're being disrespectful of the foster care system. It's the events that lead a child into the foster care system to begin with.
Right.
They've already had a breakdown of their family of origin, probably multiple breakdowns. They've already experienced some type of parental abandonment, either through death, incarceration, mental illness, drug abuse, whatever. But they've had that breakup of their original family. So that makes them even more vulnerable when they go into the foster care system. So it's not, the foster care system's doing the best they can, but there's not enough placements. There's a huge shortage of foster homes. So it's something that we've all got to work together on.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's move on with the physical health issues, and if questions come in later, we'll take some more questions at the end. So some of if you're a nurse in particular, or in the medical field, if you're EMS, these are some of the health issues that you may see that really should raise red flags for you. One is sexually transmitted infections. We used to refer to them as STDs for diseases, but now we call them STIs. This would be like syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV and AIDS. All of these are sexually transmitted infections. And if you think of someone who is being sold 25, 30 times a day, then that's 25 or 30 different partners. So it's no question, it's no doubt why they are having issues with STIs. Now, along that same line, we also have pelvic inflammatory disease with females. And PID, some of the symptoms of PID would be a high fever, generally feeling like you have the flu, body aches. There could be a lot of pelvic pain or a lot of just lower abdominal pain. And this is generally from it could be from an STI, but it's also from the normal bacteria that's in the vagina that gets pushed up into the reproductive organs. So especially with having multiple sex partners. So it can lead to scarring. It can lead to an abscess in the fallopian tubes. It can lead to a number of very painful and debilitating issues. It can also lead to infertility later on. Another is unplanned pregnancies and multiple abortions. I can remember one in particular who I know has had 18 to 20, she thinks, abortions. So the abortion is being used as a means of birth control rather than prevention. It's controlling the birth. Broken bones, that's one that we will often see that really mimics domestic violence. Probably the most common bone that's broken is the nose. And you may see that the nose is broken multiple times. There also may be a lot of facial fractures, and that's from being repeatedly hit and punched around the eye socket. That's another one where we'll see broken bones. We may see spiral fractures on the arms where they've been twisted as a means of controlling. It could be dislocated wrists, elbows, broken fingers as a means of torture.
A lot of times, broken bones are so susceptible to that because a lot of times these traffickers will use food as a controlling factor, so they may not feed them. So you run into this issue of malnutrition and brittle bones and stuff like that, and they get to these days, 10 to 30 guys, heavy guys, men that are controlling them. It's very easy for these bones to be broken to a young 14-year-old girl who's tiny already coming into these situations.
We'll also see bones that are broken that tend to be defensive wounds. So we'll see the lower arms being broken because they're raising their arms up as a defense mechanism when they're being hit with a metal pipe or a baseball bat or any kind of an object like that can break a bone. So if you think of bones that are broken from either a punch, a kick, broken ribs, or defensive wounds, that would be a red flag. particularly if you're in the hospital setting and you're looking at the x-rays and you see multiple fractures, like multiple broken noses, or the same bones being broken over and over again. That would be a huge red flag that this person is in some type of a violent situation. You don't accidentally break your nose over and over and over, okay? You may see scars from being burned. This could be cigarette burns, cigar burns. Could also be a means of marking them, much like a tattoo would be, but it's a burn like a brand. They're being branded. You may see scars from restraints. One of the common ways to restrain would be either rope, so you would see a rope burn around the wrist or the ankles or the neck. Handcuffs will oftentimes, if they're trying to get out of the handcuffs, will cut and leave scars. So that's another thing to look for. You may see stabbing wounds. Again, we see those as defensive wounds, so you may see those on the lower arms. That could be from a knife. It could also be from scissors, glass, broken bottles, anything that could create a cut. Also, vaginal and rectal scarring or bleeding. That's very common with rape victims. It's also extremely common with sex trafficking victims. So mental health issues that are associated with sex trafficking, there is a very high rate of dissociative disorders. Now this is, for those of you who are not familiar with mental health issues, this is basically breaking from reality. A dissociative disorder could be, it's rare, but it could be the development of what we used to call multiple personalities. It's now called dissociative identity disorder. But that's where they have actually created another personality who may give them a means to escape, and they're escaping in their mind because they can't escape physically. It may create some amnesia issues. They may have blackout episodes. If they are being held captive, they may not have very clear memories about what's happening or what happened to them during their time in captivity. It could be that certain things trigger these blackouts. For example, if it's someone who has been used at truck stops, it could be the smell of diesel fuel or the sound of jake brakes or anything that would remind them or sort of send them back to that event. Could be something that would make them have episodes of a memory gap. It could also be where I've heard it described as they step outside the body and they're looking at what's happening almost like it isn't happening to them, but they're watching it happen. So again, it's sort of a break from reality. For them, it's an escape from what's really happening. But we see a high rate of that, particularly with children. We also see a lot of self-destructive behaviors. Now, when I say that, oftentimes we think of cutting, but cutting is not the only self-destructive behavior. There could be binging on alcohol. It could be drug use that's self-destructive. It could be binging with food, binging and purging. We can see that, where it's more of an attempt to control what they can since they have very little control over anything at that time. But it's oftentimes they will describe it as it's something that seemed like a good idea at the time, later on, not so much. Suicide attempts are also very common with this population because it is a means of escape. It may be the only way they see to get out of it. A lot of cutting, hanging, if they have access to weapons, that would be something that they could use. But suicide attempts, frequent suicide attempts, need to be addressed, not just for sex trafficking. It could also be depression. It could be a number of things. But that could be a sign of sex trafficking. Clinical depression. Now, this is not just you wake up and you're having a bad day. This is truly like a dark cloud is hanging over this person, and they simply can't get away from it. It's debilitating. but that's commonly associated. And if you think about it, if you're being raped 10 to 30 times a day, yeah, that's depressing. PTSD, due to chronic trauma, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. We hear about it most often with our soldiers, especially the ones that are coming back from wars. But it also happens with trauma, with childhood trauma in particular. And so these young girls or boys who are involved with this will often have PTSD develop later on. Now, it could manifest in nightmares. It could be outbursts. We see outbursts a lot with the younger population. They may go into an absolute rage. It could be sweating, panic attacks, anything like this where they simply can't function, even in public particularly. But there's a high rate of PTSD in this population. There's also a high incidence of trauma bonding. You may be familiar with Stockholm Syndrome, where a captive becomes very much almost attracted to their captor. And it was named Stockholm Syndrome because of a hostage situation that happened in Stockholm back in, I think it was 1973, but it was in the early 70s, and these folks were held hostage for close to a week, and afterwards many of them really didn't want the hostages to be prosecuted. The hostage takers to be prosecuted, and that's because they have become bonded to them. It's an odd thing. It's hard to understand, but it also happens with trauma, and of course trauma is a huge part of sex trafficking, where the person who is inflicting pain or is holding them against their will is also the person who is providing them shelter, providing them with food, providing them with clothing, in some instances providing them with love. So it's the cycle of domestic violence. It's very similar to that. That creates trauma bonding, where the person knows that there is the good times are coming. They just got to get through this bad section. And if you think of it like intermittent reinforcement, one of the most popular or most addicting games is a slot machine. It provides intermittent reinforcement. Well, so does this sex trafficking situation. It's not all bad all the time. There are horrible parts of it, but then there will also be some, I've heard it called love bombardment afterwards. But this creates a very tight bond, and a lot of times it's very difficult to prosecute a trafficker because their victims won't testify against them. But that is it's not a mental illness. I don't want anybody thinking it's a mental illness, but it is a common side effect of this.
So going along, you see all these physical issues and mental health issues. Remember that this is not always just during the time of trafficking. These are victims that have been rescued, and on down the line at a later age, like the PTSD, it comes about. So that's why it's so important for these services to be available, the mental health services especially, because these a lot of times are lifelong issues. This clinical depression or the PTSD is something they're going to struggle with most of their life. So that's why services are so important to be available, to keep them kind of level to the point where they don't actually revert back into that lifestyle. Because a lot of times we will see that with rescued victims on down the line. They go back to that life they knew because maybe things aren't working out exactly how they wanted to, or it's just a way of their coping has kind of left them, and they realize, they just kind of ease back into that situation. So don't think of this as just at that moment, but this is a lifelong situation.
Very good. Okay, so how do we identify victims? Most of you who are watching probably have come in contact with victims, and you may not have known it. We've just described injuries that were similar to those of domestic violence and rape, so that's certainly something to be watching out for. These victims also have a high risk of contracting STIs and becoming pregnant. but they may seek assistance at homeless shelters or domestic violence shelters, because in their mind, they are in a relationship with their trafficker. The trafficker doesn't see it that way, but the victim often does. So if they're homeless, they may seek assistance in a homeless shelter. So if you work in a homeless shelter, just be aware of these different symptoms that you might see. The same with domestic violence shelter. Law enforcement frequently come in contact with trafficked persons, but they have a hard time determining if they are a victim or an offender. It's been for years, they were thought of as offenders only. And so for law enforcement, it's very difficult sometimes to tell the difference. We've talked about the Safe Harbor Act. Again, that ensures that children who are charged with prostitution are not treated as an offender. They are treated as a victim. But frequently victims will be branded, as I talked about earlier, but they also have there are certain tattoos that are very indicative of a trafficking situation. A lot of times it'll show the street name of their pimp. Crowns is something that we see quite often in the trafficked population. Money bags or dollar signs, anything related to money. And also a cluster of stars. And it can be a cluster of shooting stars, as you'll see in a minute. It could be just a trail of stars. And also barcodes. That's probably one of the most recent ones that we're seeing is barcode, just like you would scan at a grocery store. It's the same type of barcode, and that's another way to dehumanize the victims, is they are a commodity, and when they look at that barcode every day, they're reminded they are nothing more than a piece of property. So this is one of the tattoos that we'll see. It may be a little difficult for you to tell where this is. This is actually on the back of a young woman's neck. And the term daddy is oftentimes how they will refer to their trafficker or their pimp. So they'll say that it's their daddy or their boyfriend, not their pimp. They don't refer to him as a pimp. So this is a common, or something like this is something that you may see. It could be on the upper breast, it could be on a shoulder, on her hip, could also be on the inner thigh. Another tattoo that we see quite often is this one is on the upper thigh. If it's hard for you to read, it says King Tae, T-A-E, and that is the street name of this person's pimp. And it's just sitting there on the upper thigh. Sometimes it's on the inner thigh. But this is another example. This is an example of the barcode that I was talking about. Most of the time we see it on the back of the neck, and that's where it is on this young woman. But we're also seeing it on the inside of the lower lip. So if you are assessing a victim, if you're working with EMS, for example, and you have a person that has some mouth trauma, take a glance at the inside of the lower lip, because if you see a barcode there, then that is no doubt that person is being trafficked. This one is a little hard to make out. This is on the upper hip, right hip of a victim. The pink line that you see there is actually the waistband of the thong that she's wearing. But the tattoo says "Kip Millions," and of course millions is a reference to money, but that is the street name of her pimp. And it's located on the back, the lower back or the upper right hip. Now, the tattoo that's just above the pink line, that's dollars. It's a stack of money, 2 stacks of money actually. You could also see money bags. If you're familiar with the game Monopoly, you see the image of a man holding a money bag. We see that image, the money bag itself, on a lot of the trafficked victims. Dollar signs is very common, and this is a reference to her being a moneymaker for her pimp. Now the tattoo just above that, which would be about the middle of her back, this is the cluster of stars or the trail of stars. I'm looking at it. It's a little hard for you to make out, but I can see 4 different shooting stars in this particular tattoo, this is a reference to her being a porn star. She has been used in pornography, and that's what the tattoo indicates. Now, when you see all of these together, which is in the next slide, then there's really no question about what this person is involved in. She is a money maker for her pimp, got his name on there, and she's also been featured in pornography. So she is truly a trafficked person.
Just a note with these, I want you to realize when you're seeing these are actual victims. These aren't images that were created for shock purposes. These are real victims with real tattoos. We show you these to really give you that tangible part that it's not just information we're giving you. This is reality for these girls who have been victimized and traumatized throughout their life.
And just because you see one tattoo doesn't mean that that person is being victimized or is being trafficked. But there are certain tattoos that really make you question that. And this one, to me, there's no question on this, just because we've got 3 of the tattoos on one person. Dollar signs, like I said, dollar signs are huge. Crowns, like royal crowns. I've seen the Kip millions before, where the K in Kip had a crown hanging off of the K. So again, that just marks her as being the property of that particular pimp.
So one of the things that these tattoos are actually allowing law enforcement and other agencies to do is to track. So the organization Thorn out of California, who was actually founded by Ashton Kutcher, that's one of the things that they do, is they're scanning the internet constantly for situations. So they can scan for these type situations. The fusion centers throughout the U.S., they use these to track situations, and they use them as evidence in a conviction. So the traffickers are usually going to have the same tattoo on all their victims. So this Kip Millions, that is more than likely the one he uses on all their victims. So at that point, if you catch this predator, at that point you're able to use all those victims that you know have that as evidence of the crime, and that's who they have been trafficking. So they think it's kind of a cool thing for them to do and to dehumanize, and it helps them at that point. But in the end, thankfully, we're able to make it hurt them a little more.
And if this person is sold to another trafficker or another pimp, then what we'll see is most likely a line will be put through the Kip Millions, and then the new owner will have his name tattooed on her somewhere. The inner thighs, again, very common sight. The breasts, the shoulder blades, and the back of the neck in particular. Those are a little easier to hide with hair. And then I haven't seen anything other than barcodes used on the inner lower lip. I'm trying to think of other tattoos that would be similar. But
and you did talk about branding. This is especially in your more, in the United States, you're going to see a lot more of the tattoos. But you get into these other countries, impoverished areas, they're going to use, a rod that's heated up and to actually brand that person. They may even make a shape out of it or something like that shows that's their property. So not only do you have the trauma of the dehumanization with the barcode or something like that, but you also have the actual physical trauma of being burned or being branded like that.
One of the most horrific tattoos that I've seen, where it was obviously a trafficking victim, it was on her abdomen. And if you're familiar with Precious Moments, then you know that that's a toddler with very big eyes, very innocent looking. And she had a tattoo of a toddler that looked like a Precious Moments child that was tattooed on her lower abdomen and on her legs, so that the tattoo child was crying, and the tattoo showed the legs of the child were on the legs of the woman, so that the child's vagina was also the woman's vagina. And she was sold to men who preferred to have sex with children, but would have sex with her instead because I guess he felt like it was a little more socially acceptable. But she was sold specifically to pedophiles, that preferred very young children. But that's probably the most graphic, most horrific tattoo that I've seen. So what are some of the needs of sex trafficking victims? We've identified them. They've been rescued by law enforcement. What do they need? Well, first and foremost, they need to be safe. So they need a safe place that they can rest and recover. They need a place for housing, because all of their needs have been met by the trafficker up till this point. So they need housing, they need food, and they need clothing. Oftentimes the only clothing they've got is what they wear when they're being sold. The food, we see a lot of our victims are overweight but malnourished. There's a lot of fast food that's consumed. Nutrition is not a high value for a trafficker. But we have their what we call emergency needs, and that's the immediate needs when they're first picked up. Now, short-term needs would include legal assistance. Maybe they need legal assistance because they've been arrested multiple times for prostitution, and if it's proven that they've been trafficked, then they can, with the help of an attorney, can possibly have those charges expunged, so they would have a clean record. That will help them, of course, later on when they're trying to get a job somewhere. They may need legal assistance to help get their children back if they've lost custody of their children. They may, of course, medical care is a huge one. They'll need STI testing and treatment. They may need treatment for trauma if they've been beaten, of course, multiple rapes, but they may have some very pressing medical needs. They may need surgery because they've had broken bones that were not properly set. They didn't seek any kind of medical care for that, so they may need that kind of care. They may need care for their scars. If they had, particularly with burning scars, they may need to have some type of plastic surgery because those scars can be very painful. Not only are they disfiguring, but they can also be very painful. And so they may need help from a burn center. Many of them will have substance abuse issues. So they'll need to be detoxed, and then they'll need counseling beyond that for treatment of substance abuse. And of course, counseling just to help them cope with what's happened to them, help them get back into society. Long-term needs would be life skills. You think about it, if you've entered into the life, as it's referred to, at the age of 11 or 12, you have no life skills. You've been in this life for 7, 8 years. You may be 20 years old now, and you don't know how to write a letter, how to write a check, how to properly answer the phone. You're still, in a lot of ways, you're still that 10 or 11, 12-year-old child. So you have a lot of life skills that need to be earned. You also need an education. Many of them are not in school when they're being trafficked on a circuit 24 hours a day. They're not getting an education. So that's something that they need to receive also, is be educated. They need job skills. They need to learn how to dress for a job interview. And of course, they need a job. They need employment because they need to become self-sufficient so that they're not relying on a pimp or a trafficker to provide for them. So they need to be able to take care of themselves. Many times they can be reunified with their family, and if they can, that's wonderful. That's what we want. Oftentimes they cannot. There is a reason that they ran away from home, or there's a reason why they ended up in foster care to begin with. So reunification isn't always possible, but when it is, then we want to make sure that that happens, and we want to facilitate that. Also, if they are here from another country, then they may need repatriation so that we can get them back to their own home country.
So one of the things with reunifying, and you hope and pray that that can happen for a child to be reunited with their parents, but again, that long-term need there is not only counseling the child, but counseling the parents, because there's become so much. You may have the child that's dealing with a Stockholm Syndrome type situation or PTSD, those parents have never had to deal with that before, and there's so much education that has to be done for those parents, counseling probably individually and as a family, that really needs to be done so that the victim who is back home will really reintegrate back into that family situation.
Very good. And also, the family needs to understand how the child was lured away to begin with. What happened that got them trapped into this to begin with, so that they can monitor and help prevent it from happening again. This is just a list of resources. We mentioned them in our first program a few weeks ago. The Polaris Project National Hotline, 888-3737-888. There's also a text line from the Polaris Project where anyone can text if you have a tip, if you see something that you think may be trafficking. You can text it rather than calling it in.
Just real quick, a note on that. That text line was created in conjunction with Thorn, who I discussed earlier. They're so big with the digital world, so they came in with Polaris Project to create that as a more easy access for victims and the people who are seeing situations.
And also 800 The Lost, that's the Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We mentioned how a lot of these victims are runaways, and so they can also call 1-800 The Lost to get services and get back to their families. Okay, that's all that we have. We have our list of references if you're interested in any of those. But do we have any questions?
We do have one question that's coming in. There's a couple of parts to it. The first part is, can you expand a little more on the aftercare? You talked about the long-term, short-term, middle. Talk about aftercare for survivors.
So for those that are not immediately reunified with their families, a lot of times we see equestrian therapy that's used with them, art therapy, of course all of your talk therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, that kind of thing. Long-term substance abuse counseling, it could be Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, but any kind of therapy that helps with coping. So, and again, equestrian therapy was one of the things that I mentioned. J.C. Dugard, that was one of the things that really helped her, was equestrian therapy. Does that answer the question, or do you have anything to add? Okay.
Oh, and counseling, lifelong issues. You mentioned that earlier, that they could need counseling for a long time. What are resources? What kind of resources are available to provide that long-term counseling? And is there a specialized counseling that might be needed with individuals that have been
probably there's a lot of specialized counseling that they would need. That's one of the reasons why we would like to see more homes opened that are specifically for minors who have been picked up from sex trafficking, because they are so different, their needs are so different from other dependent children who maybe have lost a parent and have entered into the foster care system. So we would like to see them get those more specialized therapies. Am I answering the question?
So especially like, you talk about specializations, a trauma specialist, for example, is a big situation there. But you're not only going to need that trauma specialist, you're going to need somebody who is focused on maybe a family counseling situation. So you're doing a lot of different counselings. Now, some of them are, can probably do the counseling of both the trauma side and the family side. But that's, talking about the resources. And I know one thing with Camille Place that we look to do is that kind of counseling, to bring that in for the children. Not only are you on the front end with the loving care of a home, but you're getting that specialized counseling situation where they're able to be brought back into what the real world is at that point. So no longer is their real world that victimization, but the real world is people that love them and care for them. And so that's such an important side. The counseling side is very important, but you've got to have almost a counseling side from the parents who are being reunified. really communication with those victims who have come back home, sitting down daily, constantly. So that's a form of counseling in itself for these children.
Recidivism is very high with this population. When you spend so much time in chaos and then you're suddenly brought into a situation that isn't chaotic anymore, it's very hard to cope. It's very hard to adjust to that. And so they will need a lot of help with that. Substance abuse is another one. That could be a lifelong thing that they would need counseling for.
You know, I know we talked about this in our first presentation a couple of weeks ago, but could you give us some information again about the Camille Place and the funding and those kinds of things that are going on with Camille?
I'll let you kind of, since I took it last time, I'll give it to you for a little bit.
Okay. Camille Place is a 501c3 agency that was founded in 2015 specifically for sex trafficking minors. Those who have been picked up from sex trafficking. It will be a group home to house up to 20, is what we're hoping for, and be able to provide some of those other therapies like equestrian therapy and art therapy and music therapy, that kind of thing, along with education and life skills to get them ready so that when they do reach adulthood, they're a lot more likely to follow a career path and rather than go back to the trafficker.
So one of the things, you know, that's obviously this is our passion, but we want to work on all sides of it. So starting off with information, informing the public of the reality of trafficking like we're doing today. Information is power. If people don't know about it, things can't happen. Laws can't be formed, services can't be started if that information is not out there. So in hopes that we get the information out there to negate the situation all in all. We don't want to have to exist, but we're going to. We want to take it from that part to the part of taking the girls in and loving on them and caring for them, giving that safe environment that we talked about, giving them the counseling they need and even the education they need. We want to give them all prongs to make them have a life that's successful after they leave us.
And funding generally is going to be from Medicaid because most of these girls, if not all of them, will be in the custody of the Department of Human Resources. So funding would be from DHR/Medicaid, and also different foundations or grants that we can get, because it's going to take a lot more than it would for other dependent children. These girls are going to need a lot more intensive services.
In addition, last time you shared where we could find out more information specifically about Camille Place, or their places, websites, options out there to find out more information.
Yeah, so we are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, any kind of social media platform, we're probably there. We do have a website. It's CamillePlace.com. You can find out how to spell that on the first slide that lists our credentials. And you do have the ability there to learn more about it, to find out what you can do to help, whether it be monetary or voluntary. So any kind of information there. Our email addresses are there. You're welcome to email us at any time. We'll be glad to answer any questions or to find a way to get you involved. And we're also, you know, we're not only by ourselves, we're working with other organizations in constant contact, finding out what they're doing, what we can do to help them, what they can do to help us. So it's not a single drive here. You know, it's got to be a group effort, not only in Alabama and the Southeast, but around the world. So we really reach out to any entities that can be a part. This isn't just a small operation we're wanting. You know, you need those professionals and the specialized therapists and the different medical entities, equestrian therapists, and people that aren't just starting out. We want professionals. We want the real deal to make sure they're getting the extreme care that they truly need.
We have a phone call from Mobile County. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, where is Camille House located?
Where's Camille House located, I believe is what she asked.
Well, it will be in South Alabama. We list it as an undisclosed location just for protection purposes. Our corporate office is in Monroe County.
And you can find that the P.O. Box is on our website as P.O. Box 1217 Monroeville. So that's where our corporate office is. Now, that's where we'll be first. South Alabama will be our first location. We have big dreams to be a lot of other places, but for now, we'll be located in South Alabama.
Can there be private contributions, or would it help to have somebody that's in government make this happen to contribute?
All of the above.
Yeah.
we would like contributions from anybody.
Yeah.
Like we say, we are 501c3, so it is tax deductible. It is going to take a lot more money to provide these services than what we would be able to get from Medicaid and from DHR. That's just a fact. That's not a slam against either of those agencies. There's just not enough money to go around. So we will be very dependent upon grants and private donations.
Yeah, so the insurance companies and government agencies paying it, it's going to be more for the therapy side and a little bit of the housing, but you have staffing and the major part of the housing operation that will be dependent upon grants and private donations. So we definitely appreciate any help that we can get, and we hope to have other people involved. That's what it's not only a donation, we want you to be a part of it. We want to keep you informed, so we want to make sure that if you are a donor that you're a part of us.
And please contribute to any of the trafficking agencies. This is not a turf issue. There are far more victims than there are those of us who are able to help. So if you have a passion for another agency that's involved in human trafficking, by all means, please help them as well. Yeah. Like I said, no turf issues here.
Yeah, definitely a group effort, so we want to make sure all of us succeed.
We have another question that's come in via email. Is it common for human and sex trafficking victims to go back into the trafficking after they've left, and what are the best ways to prevent that from happening?
It's extremely common. Remember, one of the ways that a trafficker controls his victim is through the use of drugs. So with minors, we are better able to get them on Medicaid to get them drug treatment. For adults, they may have most of them are indigent. They're not going to have any kind of insurance. And so what we see a lot of times is they may end up in the hospital, but there's no treatment facility they can get detoxed, but there's nothing there for long term. It's a huge frustration, especially for law enforcement and for EMS, because they're picking up the same victim over and over again from overdoses or being assaulted. They can get her to the emergency room. They can get her hospitalized for a short period of time for detox, but then there's nothing for them to refer her to afterwards for that type of aftercare. So we have a little bit more that we can use for minors, but for adults, it's barren.
Yeah, and it's definitely easy. Even if don't think just because their pimp or trafficker has been arrested and convicted that victim isn't likely to go back just because of that person being gone out of the situation. There's still so many connections that they've created through drugs and other things that those people may decide they already know the vulnerabilities of that trafficked victim, so they're going to slowly start to step in at that point, and that's a lot of times what happens is, and in rare occasions you have victims of abuse, not just trafficking victims, who become the abuser. And it's the same thing with the victims of trafficking. This is possible that they become these madams of brothels and situations because they know the lifestyle, they know what works, they don't feel like they're getting what they need or they have the money they need, and they realize, hey, this is how my person made the money, so I have connections here. And a lot of times your madams are victims themselves who have become that person.
And I think that's all the questions we have at the moment. So,
okay, well, we definitely appreciate the opportunity. if you have any other questions that may come in, feel free to contact us, or if those who are watching have questions, you can send us a direct email. We'll be happy to answer those questions for you.
So you can, both of our emails for Camille Place, it's just our first name, so adam@camilleplace.com, and it's the same with Renee. Please feel free to contact us. We'll be glad to answer any questions. And again, don't forget, this was just part 2. So part 1 of human trafficking training is on the archives as well as this one be. So if you didn't get to catch the first one, we'd love for you to go back and watch that hour training on the overview of the different types of human trafficking.
Thank you.
So this concludes our program for today. I want to thank our presenters for being here, and I want to thank you for watching. As a reminder, today's program will be available on demand, so have a great day.